So let's look at trends just to make sure we understand kind of how populations work. One of the things that we tend to see reliably is as populations move from what we used to call developing, which is kind of poorer, still moving into that industrial era, we see they start to move to have low birth rate and low death rate. So starting off a population that tends to be poor, that's kind of earlier in this process, they tend to have a high death rate and they tend to have a high birth rate. And so these two things kind of cancel out. We're having lots of kids, but we're also having a lot of people not make it through a very long life. So these populations don't tend to grow very fast. At the end of demographic transition, where you've become an industrialized society, you've kind of become a very modern society where you have a small family and you tend to live long lives, what you end up with is low death rates, so people are living very long lives, they're healthy, and then you have a low birth rate where people are starting to have just one kid or two kids or maybe three kids. They're not like over here trying to have, say, 6 kids or 8 kids. Now it's just like 2's good enough. Instead of living to be 40 on average, now we're living to be 70. So this is the idea of what happens with demographic transition. High birth rate and death rate to low birth rate and death rate. Now the problem isn't on either end of this spectrum during the transition. The problem with this transition that gives us explosive population growth is what tends to happen is the death rates are the ones that fall first. So most places tend to start getting medicine, they live longer lives, but they keep having lots of kids. So initially we have these big families where instead of half the kids surviving to adulthood, all of the kids or nearly all of them survive. So we now have all these people that are hanging around, so the population just booms. And then eventually as the population booms over time, and over time could be 10, 20, 30 years, it's usually just like a generation, you start to see people favor having fewer kids. You start to see them move to the model that we in America are kind of used to, where you have, 2.5 kids, whatever it is, but a relatively small number. But in that interim, where you're healthy with big families, that's where we get the most growth. So a lot of these countries that are right in the middle of this process tend to be the ones that are growing the most because we brought them basic medical care with antibiotics. And so their death rates are plummeting, but their birth rates still remain high. And so overall, that is a recipe for huge population gains. Now, eventually, when we get to a very industrialized portion, we can oftentimes reach zero population growth. So what that means is the birth rate and death rate are essentially equal. And so this would be a population that's no longer growing at all. And this would describe many industrial countries. You've got Italy, you've got Germany, you've got Japan. There's many countries now whose population is holding steady, or in some cases is actually shrinking because they're not having a lot of kids and they're living long lives certainly, but not long enough to somehow make up for the lack of children, because some of these countries, they're now averaging less than 2 children per couple. And if you have less than 2 children per couple, that means you're not replacing the couple. So over time, the population will start to shrink a bit. Now, non-industrialized countries, they're still growing rapidly. So once again, most of our people that we're adding to poorer areas, whereas the richer areas, they're tending to have minimal growth, or in some cases, they're actually having no growth at all, or even shrinking. So this shows the overall growth rate. For a while there, it was just really large. We were hovering around 2 or greater, but you can see that the trend is that family size is decreasing and decreasing as more of the world starts to come into the modern era of longer lives, fewer kids, as more of them start to become industrialized, get medical care, get the things that we kind of take for granted here in America. And so because of this, they're also moving to more of our type of lifestyle of taking care very well of a smaller number of children. And so our growth rate is diminishing. So what that means is we're still adding people, but what we appear to be doing is just adding fewer people now. And so our population should start to kind of slow its growth and break this exponential. So we're starting to move into this more logistic point where we seem to be trying to aim towards a plateau. So that's a good thing if you worry about overpopulation, because hopefully some point in the next 50 years, we'll start to plateau where we no longer will be growing as a world, as a planet. Now, with this though, we've talked about we still have some countries growing rapidly. And so if you look at this, you'll see many of the wealthier countries, much of Europe, you have Russia, even China, the US, Canada. These countries are ultimately growing at a relatively slow pace, if at all. But we have lots of countries that are growing very rapidly. 2% or better is just very, very high. And you can see much of Africa. You can see you have some areas, when you look at the Middle East, are still growing at these very high rates. And so we have tremendous numbers of youth that are being born in these populations. And because they tend to be poorer, this compounds the issue, because that's the areas that tend to have the biggest problems with getting resources like water or getting food. And so this makes it difficult for us to try to cope with problems like world hunger. Whereas if we had more people being born to the wealthier nations, it might be easier for us to cope with, because they tend to have more access to materials. And then in between, you have quite a few areas that are still growing, but they are slowing in their growth. And that's much of Latin America, that's parts of Africa, that's parts of Asia are now starting to at least slow their growth, even though it is still growing at a decent pace. But it is good news, I suppose, that it's at least tending to slow down overall in most countries. We're moving towards the idea of zero growth, even if it's a bit slowly. And so lastly, when we want to figure out how many people we can support, so if you want to talk about this potential idea of overpopulation, which a lot of scientists are worried about, as we try to already feed 7 billion people and it's difficult, try to have enough water for 7 billion people and the food that they need, it's difficult. But there's two aspects to human carrying capacity that make it difficult for us to calculate this. The first one is we just have to figure out how many people are there and how many resources are there. And this is tricky because as we get more and more technology, we oftentimes discover new resources or discover new ways to use resources or discover how to ration our resources better so we don't need to use as much. And so it's hard to predict in the future just where the technology will be. So it's hard to predict exactly what our resource use will be 10 years from now, 20 years from now. So that makes it difficult to get a good long-term idea of how many people the Earth can support. And the second one is we have to know how much resources are used by each person. And this is interesting because if you look at the resource use per person, you'll notice that if you live in the US, we use a lot of resources, a lot. You know, if you live in Russia, Europe, you tend to use a lot more resources than someone that lives in parts of Asia, as someone who lives in parts of Africa. They're using much, much, much less. So we might be able to support 10 billion or even 15 billion people if they were living a lifestyle like that of an Indian or a Nigerian. But if we want to live a Canadian or US or most of Western European type lifestyle, we might only be able to long-term support 4 billion people or 5 billion people. And so this makes it very tricky because, and somewhat infuriating, because you might be able to sit there and go, well, if we have enough resources, if we just kind of live a reasonable lifestyle, if we have enough resources to support 15 billion people, then why are we so worried? But that's the trick, is if everybody wants to live a lifestyle like us in the US, which you can criticize if you like, we certainly use a lot of the resources of the world. But if people want to live our type of lifestyle, we can't support that many people living that type of lifestyle. So we at some point have to either stop living that type of lavish lifestyle, especially as more and more people in these countries towards the bottom start to move their way up. As they start to be more developed, as they start to use more resources, this creates a problem where we can have more and more countries using more and more resources. So we're now not supporting 7 billion people where most of them are kind of on this left-hand end. We might now be trying to support 9 or 10 billion people in the future that on average are more towards the middle here. And that's going to take a lot more resources than what we currently are using now just to sustain those people. And so that makes us, as scientists, A, little bit leery about making predictions, and B, a little bit scared because it's not necessarily a recipe for amazing things.